So this is the part two to the history of the world that I live in. And the last video didn't get into the details of where I actually live. It was mostly just historical perspectives that I wanted to share that to me explain the reason why things are the way they are where I live. Because of colonization and so on. And this is Madison, Wisconsin. So this is this used to be a necropolis, and where the Native Americans used to bury their dead. And there's many different mounds built here in the last between, I think it's like the year 800 and the year 600 and 1200, I believe. Around then is when most of the mounds were built. They were not just burial mounds, they were geometric shapes that guided people to understand the landscape so that when they traveled there they could hunt and survive, and they were like a map. So 80% of these mounds, which are religiously significant, they're burial mounds. It's a grave site. It's a holy place. They were destroyed. 80% of them were destroyed when the settlers came in. These settlers, they were U.S. citizens because the USA had become an independent republic and had expanded westward. The first Europeans to arrive in this area after the age of the exploration were very likely the French. I had a dream once where I was at my elementary school and I saw someone that looked Native American tell me something about Spanish monks. So something tells me that, some Spanish monks had explored and arrived here, because the Spanish had colonized the Caribbean. So in the 1500s, we have a situation where between the 1400s and the 1500s, there is contact between people from Iberia and West Africa. This is the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. And so the Muslim people of West Africa practiced slavery, and so did the Catholic African people of the Congo. And that resulted in a unequal truce between the Iberian um, people and their and these people that they were trading with and subjugating. And at one point, they couldn't tell the difference. And so the lines between who were the enslavers and who were the slaves was blurred, and they did not respect the humanity of these people. So this wasn't same as the slavery in Rome, where some people could have maybe rose the ranks and fulfill a skilled position later in life. These were people who were different in appearance, so they were forced to be slaves, and their descendants were forced to be slaves, and they could never escape that prejudice since they were visibly identifiable as belonging to the slave caste. And it was a very dehumanizing slavery where they were treated like animals and even worse. So it was a very sad situation that began, 1400s up to the 1500s. And it included, betrayal of the African states that were assisting in the slave trade too, by Vatican and other authorities in these Iberian kingdoms, and so it was during this time that the age of exploration had sort of begun for the Iberian people. They began to explore and find routes to the spice trade, which connected this ancient land. Since ancient times, there were people from Judea who had migrated to India, southern India, particularly like Kerala, after the time of Jesus. Shortly after, there were disciples who ventured and went there. St. Thomas. There's also Cochin, where Judean people had lived since the time of Solomon, so that was way before, hundreds of years before Jesus, and so this is what was the spice trade, and people also began to explore Asia, Eastern Asia, and so that the Iberian sailors were able to then circumnavigate Africa and open to this new world. Yet the Portuguese had become separate from Spanish because of the success. The Kingdom of Castile was the most prominent of the kingdoms in Spain. They were the ones that had launched a war against the Muslims in Spain. And from what I gather, the situation was it was a situation where it was, people were agitating and becoming martyrs, and so there was sort of injustices on both sides, and yet it eventually resulted in the reconquest of the historic peoples of Spain against the North African polities that had conquered it in the name of Islam, violently, contradictorily, and so there was a lot of violence going on, and the three Abrahamic religions couldn't. No one was able to explain how this was wrong. The authorities couldn't find peace. People couldn't understand that the Messiah just means anointed, and that there's many anointed people. They couldn't accept Jesus. The people were fighting over which Jesus was real, and confusion between the language and Muhammad. And, they call them the Mohammedans. It was very that's something that was used by other European people. Yet there's just a lot of division between very similar paths, very similar traditions, really all pointing towards the same thing, all talking about the same thing. And so that's how this situation arose. I believe that the name Portugal is just the name of a port city. It was Cali. I think it's still a city here, and so it's a beautiful place where thanks to God, I was able to visit Lisbon. And so but it became separate from Spain. And people from Portugal ended up going to Spain. And that's how in Latin America you see people with Portuguese names, yet their ancestors came from Spain. So that can happen. And Christopher Columbus, he was from Genoa, and we have ancestors from Liguria, which is the state that Genoa belongs to. And so Christopher Columbus couldn't get support from people in his side of the world, so he got support from the Queen of Spain and sailed to the Americas. Had arrived in the Dominican Republic, and from there, more and more sailors began colonizing the Caribbean, eventually allying with the Native American enemies of Tenochtitlan, the city of the Mexica, or the Mexica. That's where the word Mexico comes from. I was taught that by a professor at the UNAM. It's one of the oldest university in the Americas, and its own city next to Mexico. And so this is the Spanish colonization. This was the first largest colonization of the Americas. And so which was by Castilian, supported by the Castilian kingdoms. And so it took time for people to get to Mexico. And the people of these lands were sophisticated people. They were gardeners, and they had pyramids and temples and other structures. And there was actually a king of Mexica of Tenochtitlan, who was not from there. He was from Texcoco. Maybe I'm confused yet. There's this king, and his name Nahualcoyotl, and he had this garden that you see here was established by people before him and maintained by him, and he had lots of plants and so this is what it looks like. It's almost like Central Park. Can you imagine that? The castle has its own history. This was developed during the time of French. There was a French emperor of Mexico during colonial times, but we're focusing now on the pre-colonial times. This would have been in the early 1500s. And this King Nahuatl, King Nahualcoyotl, Netzahualcoyotl, I'm mispronouncing his name, please forgive me. He was significant because he supposedly had built a white temple to end sacrifices, to end human sacrifices, and so he had a very important role, very similar to Abraham in the Mesopotamian world, and this person we know quite a bit about, and he left a lot of poetry in Nahuatl, the native language. And so what I believe is that when the Spaniards and all these other Europeans showed up, they would ask the Mexica, where are they from? Like, who are they? And they would say Aztlan, because that was their native homeland. They would say that they were not from there. And then people started calling them Aztecs. That's I learned where the word Aztec came from. And what I believe is that Aztlan is a place called Cahokia outside of St. Louis. It's the largest pyramid in North America, and it's a mound pyramid. Yet I believe that there could be a structure underneath it. I've asked ChatGPT about it, asking if any officials have ever made any observations, and it said that people have said that there is a step pyramid underneath it. Yet that's not the reason why I believe. The reason why I believe is because if you look at the photos of step pyramids in Mexico in the 1800s, when people first started photographing them, the ones in the jungle, they were completely covered in vegetation and soil, and so they look very similar to these, and yet because of all the injustices and because of fear, these things have been covered up. And what I believe is that there is a natural catastrophe that the Native Americans knew about that occurs here where I live, um, which is sort of like a geyser of some sort that spews out a bunch of sand, and and that caused a migration of people down the Mississippi, which there was already trade. We're talking year 1200 when the mounds stopped being built, because then Tenochtitlan was built in the 1300s. And so these people already were trading with people in the Gulf, and um, they found, um, even in places far up north, there's a state park called Aztlán State Park, which was named by a modern archaeologist because he thought that it could be the mythical homeland of the Mexica. And there they found a mummy of a young princess that had you know some illnesses, and she was buried with all these shells, and so the shells were the from the Gulf, surprisingly. So they found shells from the Gulf up here, and so there was trade, and so they quickly left. They were able to leave. They knew where to go. They ended up going down the coasts because people are living all around here. Where are they going to go? They're going to go where there's something interesting happening. Maybe there's a volcano erupting or something like that at the time, so they gravitate towards that and go towards there. Likewise, that could be a reason why Phoenician or Viking explorers could have arrived to Wisconsin in the past, similarly because of this place, this event. And then the other people migrated southwest, I believe, and lived there, and so that's why there's different people that speak similar languages, yet they're not all connected. The people who speak Nahuatl live only in this region here and have spread. So over time they spread and it became more widespread. You look at the Mississippian people, they have a very similar culture. So we'll go to this is a website all about Native American people that you can explore. It's in Spanish. So this is the Mississippian culture. Now the word Mississippi is an Algonquin word. The language that the Mississippian people spoke is not clear to me. I don't know what language they spoke, but what I believe is that all the language families that now occupy this region, or that did at contact around the year 1600, were populations of people that had migrated there and had families with the remnant populations of the ancient inhabitants. and like the Siouan family, language family, Siouan languages like Ho-Chunk, uh, those are distributed all around this area nowadays. Yet there is some people in the East Coast, in the southern East Coast, that speak Siouan languages, and that's where I believe they originated. Same thing with Algonquin people. Algonquin language is the first Bible to be written in the United States was written in Algonquin, and so the Algonquin language family represents a large group of languages that spread throughout the Great Lakes, and and uh, and so that went. We'll have to see Great Lakes, and so the Algonquin people. Likewise, there's a population of people that speak that language on the East Coast, and they traveled all throughout the Great Lakes. And there's even people in Montana who speak in an Algonquin language. And one of the languages that is spoken in Michigan and Wisconsin is Ojibwe, also known as Chippewa. And because of the anglicization of the word Ojibwe, and so these people colonized this area, and that's where we get the word Mississippi. The word Misi is sometimes also uh, uh, written Gichi, and it's meaning great, and then the rest of it is the river. It's a great river. Likewise, the name for God, one of the names for God is Gichi Manadu, the Great Spirit, or also translated sometimes as the Great Mystery. This region here is very unique. The Native American people that lived here in ancient times harvested copper, and I read a book that was sort of out there, yet it had imagined, had seen pattern and the evidence that it found, and hypothesized that the people who lived here in ancient times would harvest the copper and then immediately send it off in these ingots that would travel to the sea and then eventually make it to the Bronze Age world. And I believe it. I think it's possible because of what this book said about there being no places where they process the copper, and also the form of the ingots that they would find would look like an animal hide, in the shape of like an animal hide, and I think this is before the time of the Ojibwe. Of course, the Ojibwe people had families with the descendants of these ancient Native Americans, and it was known that all these people in this region used copper. In fact, the Mexica also used copper, and so these people are all connected through trade. Back then, they didn't have horses, so people would not travel easily far distances without a canoe. Yet people did have dogs, and so you could sled in the snow when there was snow. And back then, there was a lot of snow. and then you can, travel by foot, which is, you can get pretty far too on foot. Um, and so uh, the the Mississippian people seem to have, these are all pyramids. Now imagine that. These are all pyramids, different types of pyramids. There's the orange are cemeteries. The purple are effigy mounds, so those are some sort of spiritual significance or ritual significance, or geographical significance. What I've found is that most of them are geographical. They show like an eagle where the best vantage point is, and so you can navigate the environment. It'll show you like a goose where the geese migrate, and likewise for bears and things like that. And the rituals are mostly related to the tribal identities, because a tribe will associate with a specific type of animal, and so you'll have like a bunch of bears walking, and maybe that's where the tribe would go at a certain time of year because they were the people of the bear or something like that. Um, and and so the spiritual significance is, there's narratives and things like that, that there might be some mythical creatures that convey something practical, or perhaps something mythical that conveys some sort of wisdom. And then you have here the different categorizations that archaeologists have found. This AC is just the Spanish way of saying antes de Cristo is BC, and DC is después de Cristo, or what we call AD. So BC, AD, before Christ, Anno Domini. That's sort of what it is in English. And so you can see here the art of these people looks very Mexica, looks very similar to the Native American people in Mexico. So this is Cahokia, and Cahokia is oriented around the moon. So it's oriented along this is in Illinois, in the state of Illinois, and this is oriented with the moon, and and the sun, and it, it's a calendar. It's really impressive, the sort of things that these sites, and they're numerous. I mean, there's so many all over the United States, yet few people hear about these things in public school and things like that. It's and so this is sort of why there already was in ancient times a connection between where I live and the places that today speak Spanish. But right now we're talking about the Spanish colonization, and so the Spanish colonization eventually went and colonized this part. They named it New Spain because they thought it was going to be the new Spain. The word Spain comes from Hispania, which was an ancient Ibero-Celtic word that the Romans used to call the Iberian Peninsula. So this whole area was Hispania. And so that's where the word Hispanic comes from. All the Hispanic people are connected to Spain somehow, whether it's their language, their ancestors, and um, and so and so um, and so yeah, this became the colony of New Spain, And attached to the colony of New Spain was Florida, which was La Florida is like the flowery place, essentially. And it covered a huge region, basically Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Atlanta, kind of this whole place. All of these places that the U.S. Settled, they were all really difficult places. Like Walt Disney had filled in, you know, all of the land in order to create Disneyland or Disney World. I forget which one it is. It's all marsh. It's all wetland. And the Spanish did not really colonize those parts. There were some forts, in here, that they built. Yet the Spanish were mostly, when they were talking about Florida, they were really talking about the Panhandle and everything above it. And so one of the explorers sort of went in, and I think he got as far north as Missouri, and did a whole, a big loop around from Missouri all the way back down. And during that time, he, just went to war with all these tribes and, spread diseases. And it's said that the last remnant populations of the Mississippian people died because of that event. And so by the time that the English had explored or the French had explored, these people were already gone, and or their lifestyle was very different, and had lost knowledge of their ancestral ways. And so the U.S. became an independent country, and so that's one reason why I believe Spanish monks could have traveled here, because this was an area of extreme religious significance to everyone who lived around it. And it's a very unique geographical feature. It had mounds. It was just known to be a sacred place because that's where the people buried the dead. And in the Mexica, I learned that in the Mexica worldview, the North generally has a connotation of death, because if you think the North is where the ice and the cold, and it's more difficult to live, whereas the South is where you get all the fruits and trees and things like that growing. And we don't often think about that yet. If you think of like pecans, think about where where things like that grow. There's many other things that have been introduced in modern history, like oranges. They're grown in Florida. You have peaches too. They're grown in the South. You have plants from ancient times like the pawpaw, which are very, people who don't hear about it because it wasn't commercialized. There's other plants and trees. Corn or maize originally came from Mexico and had traveled north, and that was like in the year, I want to say like 800 BC was when corn or maize started arriving to the northernmost parts of North America. And so one of the people groups that were one of the furthest north maize growers was the Iroquois people. And so the Iroquois people had suffered a very similar situation that the people in Mesopotamia suffered, because now they have this hunter-gatherer, the energy of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle has nowhere to go, and you're sitting and you're cultivating land. And so there was a lot of violence because you had men that didn't have a role anymore, and so they began to fight against each other. And the Iroquois would fight against all the other tribes that hadn't settled down, that were speaking the same language, were the same people, but they hadn't cultivated corn, and so they hadn't become sedentary, and maize, so and so and so the Iroquois people are from the southeast, just like all these other tribes. They traveled north and ended up establishing, and their form of government was one of the inspirations for the USA. They had established a government between all the tribes with a central home, a longhouse, where they would all meet. And this was in New York. And so the French had traveled into this area, up the Mississippi, all around the Great Lakes. Yet I don't know, I never have heard of anything about Madison, but there's a lot of names here that are French, Lacrosse. You have Prairie du Chien, this is the Prairie of the Dog. And so those are remnants. Eau Claire, Clearwater, and so you have a lot of different things. And Madison then became a city once the USA colonized it, and was named after one of the presidents who had just died because the landowner had wanted to make the city the capital. And I read in a book that when this land was settled, the lakes were crystal clear. Now they're full of algae, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes when water is clear, it can be a sign of heavy pollution. So it's good to stay a little optimistic and be thankful that it's not clear because of heavy pollution. Yet there are places where it's clearer, and where people don't go as often. And so there's very likely some destructive event, that is the reason why the ancient Native Americans didn't live here, and why they decided to place their necropolis here. And possibly before that there were some structures that were built. I've seen some rocks around here that look like they could be part of some greater structure that was buried by the sand. So there's something that could have been around before they learned their lesson, and there could have been some. It's likely. I'm not saying that it's true, but it's possible that there could have been some step pyramids or some structures here that were created by ancient Native Americans. Especially the moving of stones. There's a lot of stones, and unfortunately the farmers moved a lot of the stones. The stones were brought by the glaciers. This was all glaciated, and so the glaciers basically came from the north, and that's what created the Great Lakes. All this land that you see here, it's part of an ancient tectonic fault, a rift that's breaking the North American continent in half, and that's just the heavier magma, igneous rock that wasn't crushed by the ice, the miles of thick of ice, and so that's why that peninsula exists. And so that's also why these lakes formed, because this is right at the edge. So imagine this is melting and freezing repeatedly. Yet I believe that there's some other reason why they're shaped that way. I struggle to believe that because there's no other thing like it along the edge of the glacier, and so yeah, similar thing happened in Northern Europe. You had glaciers, you had glacial stones. The Germanic tribes moved, and the Celtic tribes moved these stones. The Slavic tribes, Baltic, everyone, they moved these stones in patterns, because that's what humans do. I'm sure the Sami people, the Siberian people of the north too, did that too, and so I had heard someone say that the ancient people of Scandinavia were more similar to the Native American people, in that they have a shared heritage, shared ancestors from Siberia. And so humans crossed this land bridge when it was full of ice, and they found people in ancient skeletons in places in river valleys across the southwest, in Mexico and all these different places, and that show that humans arrived way earlier than they expect. There's also places down in Chile that suggest that too. And so what archaeologists and anthropologists have discovered is that before this migration that we all know about, of people migrating from Asia to America over the ice, there were people that were migrating on canoes. And so they would just go down the coasts eating, wildlife and seaweed and all these things. And it's one of the reasons why the Native American people of Chile have a enough iodine in their diet. Nowadays you get table salt. It says iodine. It has iodine. It's a nutrient that was added to our salt because humans weren't getting enough of it. There's certain parts of the world where it's very hard to get iodine, and one of the sources of iodine in diet is seaweed. And so in Chile, there are people that cultivate seaweed. The lifestyles of the people in Chile are very interesting because they're on the ocean, and there's one that captivates me, which is they put a fence out on the water, and so when the tide goes back, it basically catches all of or a net, but it's like a fence that's stuck in the ground, and then when the tide goes back, it catches all the fish. And so that's one way that they caught fish. And so our ancestors, our Native American ancestors, were from this part of the world. They belonged to the Mapuche people group. They spoke the Mapudungun language, and the ancestors are from a mother of someone on our father's side, because the patrilineal, each one inherits the father's Y chromosome, and our ancestors are from North Africa, if you follow that. So the Native American ancestors we have came from a mother on the father's side. So we didn't inherit that any particular thing that could identify us as belonging to a group, but we, if you look at my DNA, my genome, I share part of my genome with living populations today of the Mapuche people. That's why, those tests can that's how they work. Is they took living samples of people today, or recently, and they're comparing it, and so I will share a portion of my genome will match theirs because of our shared ancestry. We have, if you go back far enough, we have similar ancestors, and so we inherited similar patterns in our genome. And And so the Mapuche people, I've heard that they are probably from the Amazon. So imagine, the population of humans, in Europe, they started out, here in this part of the world, and then went north. Likewise, humans, from Africa, and they spread north. Roman Empire spread north. Now imagine it upside down. These people, our ancient ancestors, they started out closer to the equator where there was more plentiful food, and on this side of the Andes Mountains, and where life was more abundant, and migrated south towards Antarctica and colonized the entire southern cone. So by the time the Spanish came, all of this land here in Argentina was Mapuche, and so was Chile. Now, the word Mapuche is a very generic term. It just means the people of the land. There are tribes with specific names, and Mapuche is one of them. That's what in Chile and Argentina, people just call them Mapuche, but there's Huiliche, there's Pehuenche. So the Pehuen is a tree in the Andes Mountains, and so the people of Chile that live in this, it's hard to see because of the resolution, but you can see these are forests in the mountains, and this is where the Pehuen is. And so the Pehuen, these are the Pehuenche, the people of the Pehuen. There's some tribes in southern Argentina, yet Argentina got very colonized, similar to the USA. So the people, most of the Mapuche people live in Chile. And most people have, ancestors who are Mapuche. They're not Mapuche themselves in the sense that, they don't have, they lost their culture through colonization, and now are more identified with the national culture of the independent republic. And Chile used to be a smaller country. It didn't used to go as north, and it didn't used to go as south, and it expanded just like the United States expanded westward, and colonized Madison. It expanded west. Chile expanded north and south, colonizing southern Chile. At one point, it had actually had thought it owned a portion of Patagonia. So there was, a piece of Chile on the other side of the Andes, and so there's a lot of connection between Argentina and Chile since ancient times. And the reason why the people believe that they're from the Amazon is because this is because of animals that they would talk about in their narratives. Animals that are only found in the Amazon. And so if you go back far enough, ancestors, from all over. But yeah, Madison is special to me because it seems like it's a miracle that I'm here, and it's the house of what I believe is my grandfather, and it's on a sacred Native American site, and I think it's meaningful. It all happened for a reason, and God balances all the injustices, and yet the sins of our ancestors, our sins, they go create one injustice after another, and so important not to sin against each other with violence and other injustices. And that's why I seek to understand Islam, and because I really believe it's connected to all the other Abrahamic religions, and it's true. it is connected, and all of that sort of conflict started in Spain. And so when I pray and I think about Islam and prayer, I think about the three Abrahamic religions, and just finding peace, making the connection, drawing the connections between them. And that's why I warn people, because there's been so many injustices in this world. We want to do the right thing, and so it's good to know what's been happening and what sort of situation we're inheriting. And so nowadays, this whole land is, it speaks English, it speaks Spanish. These are not the languages of Native America. The largest Native American language is Quechua, which is part of the Incan Empire. They weren't called the Incan Empire, just like you say Kemet for ancient Egypt, which is more authentic. The authentic word for the Incan Empire is Tiwantinsuyu, which means something like the four directions or something like that. It's actually very similar to a name that Kemet had. There's a name that Baba Haru often says, and I can't remember. Yet Tiwantinsuyu was the name of what we call the Incan Empire. The Inca was the king, so that's where the name Tupac comes from, and was one of the Inca. And yeah, so the Inca had gone as far south as Santiago, and that's where I was born. And the Inca and the Mapuche had fought, and so they didn't go any further south. There was also people here that are called the Diaguitas. They were very sophisticated, a lot of ceramics and things like that, and so they assimilated very quickly to the Spanish, and so their culture was lost. The Mapuche, since they lived in a more hunter-gatherer lifestyle, that was, they basically were domesticating forests, and they had pine trees with big pine nuts. The seeds of the puen are very big, much bigger than any pine tree in Europe or anywhere else. And so they would eat those and hunt the animals, and eat from all different sorts of plants. There's grasses, corn, different types of corns, and there's also different types of grasses that are not known, that were never really fully domesticated, but they were, people would pick them and eat them. And so, there's lots of things. But you got to be careful with things that are not from where you're from, even if they are your ancestors' plants and things like that. Plants can be dangerous. Plants, they don't move, and so they create chemicals that hurt the people that try to eat them. And I think I'm coming up on Maghrib. I have the faith that to pray morning and night, and so lately I've been considering that night refers to the time of Isha, when the sun is completely gone from the day, and because the sunset is such a beautiful thing, why would we want to miss that? And so yet I believe that the sunset is an important time to pray too. So we'll see how we're doing on time here. But yeah, basically that's the world that I live in. So I think I made a good time, and hope you can find the truth of it. May God bless you and guide you to the truth of things and help us, guide us to the truth of things, and help us live in union with God's true nature so that we gain blessings and and can sustain each other, sustain holy life